Texas encompasses multiple ecological zones that supported distinct human populations for over 13,000 years. The Gulf Coast provided marine resources and stable water access. River valleys cutting through limestone plateaus offered reliable springs and diverse plant communities. High plains and desert basins presented seasonal challenges and opportunities. Archaeological evidence from these environments remains unevenly preserved. Coastal sites suffer from sea level change and erosion. Rock shelters in the interior yield stratified deposits spanning millennia. The archaeological record reflects this preservation bias rather than actual population distribution. Understanding prehistoric Texas requires accounting for what has survived and what has been lost. The physical geography of Texas created fundamentally different conditions for human occupation across the region. The Gulf Coast extended roughly 300 miles along the western edge of the Gulf of Mexico. During the late Pleistocene, sea levels stood lower than today, exposing additional coastal plain that is now submerged. As sea levels rose through the Holocene, the coastline shifted inland, drowning early sites and creating the barrier island system and estuaries present in recent millennia. These estuaries produced oysters, fish, and waterfowl, in quantities that supported year-round occupation. Fresh water from rivers mixing with salt water created productive nursery habitats. The coastal plain itself consisted of grasslands, oak mottes, and seasonal wetlands. Major river systems drained the interior. The Rio Grande formed the southern and western boundary, flowing from mountain sources through desert basins before reaching the Gulf. The Colorado River cut through central limestone plateaus, creating valleys with permanent springs. The Brazos and Trinity Rivers drained the central and eastern portions. The Red River marked the northern boundary, flowing eastward through rolling prairies. These rivers provided not only water, but also concentrations of aquatic resources, riparian plant foods, and travel routes. Valleys often contained deeper soils suitable for plant growth compared to surrounding uplands. The Edwards Plateau occupied the central region, characterized by limestone bedrock, thin soils, and spring-fed streams. Elevation ranged from roughly 1,000 to 3,000 feet. The plateau contained numerous rock shelters formed by erosion of limestone layers. These shelters preserved organic materials and stratified deposits that provide detailed chronological sequences. Vegetation consisted primarily of juniper, oak, and grasslands. Spring discharge supported localized riparian zones with walnut, pecan, and diverse herbaceous plants. The Balcones Escarpment marked the plateau's eastern and southern edge, where springs emerged at the contact between porous limestone and underlying impermeable layers. East of the plateau, the landscape transitioned to rolling hills and pine forests. Soils became deeper and rainfall more abundant. This region graded into the piney woods, part of the broader southeastern forest zone. Rivers here moved more slowly through floodplains that supported bottomland hardwoods. The environment resembled adjacent portions of Louisiana and Arkansas more than it did western Texas. Archaeological evidence indicates that populations in this zone maintained connections with groups to the east and developed distinct cultural patterns, including earthen mound construction in later periods. The High Plains occupied the northern portion of the region, extending from the Caprock Escarpment westward. This flat to gently rolling grassland supported bison herds during certain periods. Playas, shallow ephemeral lakes, provided seasonal water sources. Permanent water was limited to spring-fed streams in canyon systems that cut through the plains. The Canadian River and its tributaries created such canyons, offering sheltered camping locations and access to lithic resources. During dry periods, these canyons became critical for human survival on the plains. The Trans-Pecos region in far western Texas consisted of desert basins and mountain ranges. Elevations varied from roughly 2,000 feet in the basins to over 8,000 feet in the Guadalupe and Davis Mountains. Precipitation increased with elevation, creating vegetational zones from creosote desert scrub to pine and fir forests on the highest peaks. Water sources were scattered and often seasonal. Permanent springs occurred in certain canyons and at mountain bases. The Rio Grande provided the most reliable water, though its desert corridor offered limited food resources compared to its middle and lower reaches. Climate varied substantially across these zones and through time. The coastal region experienced subtropical conditions with high humidity and rainfall exceeding 30 inches annually in most periods. The Edwards Plateau received between 15 and 30 inches, concentrated in spring and fall. The High Plains averaged 15 to 20 inches, with high evaporation rates and periodic drought. The Trans-Pecos received less than 15 inches in the basins, with mountain areas receiving somewhat more. Temperature ranges were extreme in the interior, particularly on the High Plains and in the Trans-Pecos, while the coast experienced moderated conditions due to maritime influence. These environmental differences created distinct resource bases. The coast provided marine and estuarine foods available year-round. The Edwards Plateau offered concentrated spring resources, acorns in oak groves, and deer in moderate numbers. East Texas provided abundant deer, turkey, nuts, including hickory and acorn, and diverse plant foods in the rich bottomlands. The High Plains during wet periods supported large bison herds, but offered limited plant diversity. The Trans-Pecos required detailed knowledge of scattered water sources and seasonal plant availability. Lithic raw materials occurred unevenly. High-quality chert appeared in Edwards Plateau limestone formations, particularly in certain stream gravels and bedrock outcrops. This material was traded across long distances. Alabates chert from the Canadian river breaks in the northern High Plains also circulated widely. Obsidian from Trans-Pecos sources reached archaeological sites hundreds of miles distant. Basalt and other volcanic stones occurred in western mountains. Coastal populations had limited access to quality stone and often used shell for cutting tools. The diversity of environments meant that no single adaptation characterized prehistoric Texas. Groups occupying the coast developed specialized knowledge of estuarine ecology and seasonal patterns of fish and shellfish. Plateau populations required knowledge of spring locations, rock shelter sites, and plant ripening schedules across elevation gradients. Plains groups needed to track bison movements and locate reliable water in a landscape where many sources were ephemeral. Desert populations survived through intimate knowledge of widely scattered resources and precise timing of seasonal availability. This environmental mosaic also meant that climate changes affected different regions differently. Warming or cooling altered the distributions of plant and animal species, but the magnitude and direction of change varied by location. Drought that devastated plains populations might have minimal impact on coastal groups. Rising sea levels transformed coastal settlement patterns while leaving interior populations largely unaffected. Understanding prehistoric human adaptations requires attention to these regional and temporal variations rather than assuming uniform conditions across the entire area. Prehistoric human occupation of Texas spanned more than 13,000 years, involving populations with varying subsistence strategies, technologies, and social organizations. The archaeological record indicates cultural diversity rather than a single trajectory of development. Different regions supported different population densities and encouraged different forms of adaptation. The number of people living in Texas at any given time remains uncertain, but archaeologists estimate populations ranged from a few thousand during the earliest periods to perhaps several tens of thousands by late prehistoric times. Human groups during the Paleo-Indian period, roughly 13,000 to 8,000 years ago, appear to have lived in small mobile bands. Band size likely ranged from 25 to 50 individuals, though larger aggregations may have occurred seasonally at particularly rich resource locations. These groups moved across large territories, following game animals and seasonal plant resources. The distribution of Paleo-Indian projectile points across the landscape suggests that movement patterns covered hundreds of miles annually. Social organization probably centered on extended family groups with flexible membership and minimal hierarchy. The Archaic period, extending from roughly 8,000 to 1,300 years ago, saw changes in mobility and settlement. Early Archaic groups remained highly mobile, similar to Paleo-Indian patterns. Middle and late Archaic populations showed increasing evidence of territorial behavior and repeated use of specific locations. Burned rock middens, accumulations of fire-cracked stone from plant processing, grew to substantial size at certain sites, indicating decades or centuries of reuse. This pattern suggests that groups maintained rights to particular territories and returned to them regularly. Band sizes likely remained similar to earlier periods, but the intensity of site use increased. Population estimates for the Archaic period vary by region. The Edwards Plateau appears to have supported relatively dense populations compared to surrounding areas, possibly due to reliable spring water and diverse food resources. Rock shelters provided shelter and storage opportunities that enhanced the value of plateau locations. The Gulf Coast also supported substantial populations, particularly where estuaries provided abundant shellfish and fish. The high plains supported lower densities, with populations concentrated along permanent water sources in canyon systems. Cemetery sites from the late Archaic period provide evidence of social organization. These cemeteries contain dozens to hundreds of burials accumulated over extended periods. Grave goods appear in some burials, but not others, suggesting incipient social differentiation. Some individuals received more elaborate treatment or more numerous artifacts. However, the differences remain modest compared to hierarchical societies documented elsewhere in North America. The presence of cemeteries indicates that groups maintained territorial claims and returned to specific locations for mortuary purposes. The late prehistoric period, from roughly 1,300 to 500 years ago, brought additional changes. Population densities appear to have increased in most regions. Settlement patterns shifted in some areas toward larger, more permanent villages. In East Texas, populations developed more complex social organization, including ranked societies with hereditary leadership. Archaeological evidence includes earthen mound centers, elaborate burial practices, and concentrations of exotic trade goods. These developments aligned with broader patterns in the southeastern United States. Caddo populations in northeast Texas lived in dispersed farmsteads and hamlets, organized around ceremonial centers. Population estimates for Caddo groups at their height suggest several thousand individuals spread across northeast Texas and adjacent portions of surrounding states. Villages consisted of multiple households, each housing extended families. Houses were substantial pole and thatch structures capable of sheltering 10 to 20 people. Fields surrounded the villages, planted with corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers. Wild resources remained important, particularly deer, nuts, and seasonal plant foods. Central Texas populations during the late prehistoric period continued earlier patterns of high mobility and reliance on wild resources. Population densities may have increased, but evidence for large permanent villages is absent. Groups lived in small camps that moved seasonally. Bison hunting became more important during certain periods when bison ranges expanded southward. The bow and arrow, introduced around 1300 years ago, improved hunting efficiency. Pottery appeared in small quantities but never achieved the ubiquity seen in East Texas. The high plains supported bison hunting populations during periods when climate conditions favored grassland expansion and bison were present. During dry periods, bison retreated northward, and human populations either followed them or shifted to alternative resources in canyon systems. Population densities fluctuated with these movements. When bison were abundant, the plains could support relatively high densities of mobile hunters. When bison were absent, populations contracted to areas with permanent water. The Trans-Pecos region supported the lowest population densities. Water scarcity limited the number of people the landscape could sustain. Groups lived in small bands that moved frequently between scattered water sources and seasonal resource patches. Rock shelters in canyon systems show evidence of repeated occupation, but rarely contain the deep deposits characteristic of Edwards Plateau sites. Some groups maintained connections with populations in northern Mexico and the Southwest, evidenced by occasional finds of southwestern ceramics and other trade items. Social organization across prehistoric Texas varied with subsistence strategy and environmental productivity. Mobile hunting and gathering groups maintained relatively egalitarian social structures with leadership based on achievement and situational needs. Groups that developed more intensive resource use, particularly in East Texas with agriculture, developed more formalized leadership structures. However, even among Caddo populations, social hierarchy remained modest compared to chiefdoms documented along the Mississippi River or in the Southeast. Trade networks connected Texas populations with groups across a broad area. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast appears in archaeological sites hundreds of miles inland. Edwards Plateau chert traveled to the coast, the plains, and into surrounding states. Alabates chert from the northern plains reached central and southern Texas. Obsidian from Trans-Pecos and New Mexico sources occurs in small quantities at sites across the region. Copper items, likely originating in the Great Lakes region, appear rarely in late prehistoric contexts. These patterns indicate that exchange networks operated over long distances, moving both practical materials and prestige items. The mechanisms of exchange remain debated. Direct trade between groups certainly occurred. Marriage alliances between bands would have facilitated material transfers. Down-the-line exchange, where materials passed through multiple groups, probably accounts for the movement of exotic items over very long distances. Some materials, particularly high-quality lithics, may have been obtained through direct procurement expeditions to distant sources. The relative importance of these mechanisms varied by time, place, and material. Conflict between groups occurred, though its frequency and intensity remain uncertain. Skeletal remains occasionally show evidence of violent death, including projectile points embedded in bone and cranial trauma. Some cemetery populations show elevated rates of trauma compared to others. Defensive positioning of certain sites suggests concern about attack. However, evidence for widespread or sustained warfare is limited. Most violence appears to have been small-scale raiding or interpersonal conflict rather than organized combat between large groups. Cultural diversity increased through time as regional adaptations became more pronounced. Early Paleo-Indian populations showed relatively uniform technology across broad areas, suggesting high mobility and extensive social networks. By the late Archaic and late prehistoric periods, distinct regional traditions were clearly established. Projectile point styles, house forms, burial practices, and subsistence strategies varied markedly between East Texas, Central Texas, the High Plains, and the Trans-Pecos. This diversification reflects both environmental adaptation and the development of distinct cultural identities among increasingly territorial populations. The earliest widely accepted evidence for human presence in Texas comes from Clovis culture sites dating to approximately 13,000 years ago. Clovis projectile points, characterized by distinctive fluting on both faces and careful pressure flaking, appear across the state. These points occur as isolated surface finds, in buried contexts with extinct megafauna, and in cache deposits. The distribution suggests that Clovis populations ranged across all environmental zones, though site preservation varies considerably by region. The Galt site in Central Texas provides the most extensive evidence for Clovis occupation. Located along Buttermilk Creek in Bell County, the site contains dense concentrations of Clovis artifacts, including projectile points, bifaces, blades, and debitage from stone tool manufacture. Excavations have revealed stratified Clovis deposits with evidence for repeated occupation. The artifact density and diversity suggest that Galt served as a base camp rather than a temporary hunting station. Researchers estimate that the site was occupied multiple times over several centuries during the Clovis period. Faunal remains from Clovis contexts in Texas include extinct megafauna, particularly mammoth and extinct forms of bison. The Aubrey site in north-central Texas contained Clovis points associated with mammoth remains. However, the relationship between the artifacts and the bones remains debated, as clear evidence of butchery is limited. Other sites show Clovis associations with extinct bison, horse, and camel. The extent to which Clovis populations specialized in megafauna hunting versus pursuing diverse prey remains uncertain. Small animal bones and plant processing tools at some sites indicate a broader subsistence base. Pre-Clovis occupation has been proposed based on evidence from several Texas sites, most notably the Buttermilk Creek complex at the Galt site. Excavations below the Clovis layer recovered thousands of stone artifacts from deposits dated to approximately 15,000 years ago. These artifacts include simple flakes, blade-like pieces, and bifacial tools, but lack the distinctive Clovis point form. The stratigraphy appears intact, with the pre-Clovis layer clearly separated from overlying Clovis materials. Soil analysis and dating support the antiquity of these deposits. The pre-Clovis claim remains controversial within the archaeological community. Critics question whether the artifacts represent intentional human manufacture or natural breakage. The simple nature of the tools makes diagnostic determination difficult. Unlike Clovis points with their distinctive fluting and careful manufacture, pre-Clovis pieces at Buttermilk Creek lack clear diagnostic features. Some researchers argue that the dating may be problematic or that the artifacts were displaced from younger deposits. Proponents maintain that the quantity of material, the stratigraphy, and the dating evidence support human presence before Clovis. Other sites have yielded possible pre-Clovis materials, but evidence remains equivocal. Friedkin's site, also in central Texas, produced similar simple flake tools from deposits potentially predating Clovis. The Deborah L. Friedkin site and Buttermilk Creek complex may represent the same cultural phenomenon. However, few sites beyond these locations have produced convincing pre-Clovis evidence. The scarcity of sites contrasts with the widespread distribution of Clovis materials, suggesting either that pre-Clovis populations were extremely small or that evidence preservation is poor. Site preservation issues complicate interpretation of early human presence. Rising sea levels submerged the late Pleistocene Gulf Coast, potentially drowning early coastal sites. River valleys have experienced repeated episodes of erosion and deposition, destroying or burying early sites. Surface erosion on the high plains and in desert regions removes or scatters artifacts. Rock shelters in the Edwards Plateau provide better preservation, but even these sites show evidence of mixing and disturbance in lower levels. The distribution of Clovis sites shows concentrations in certain areas and scarcity in others. Central Texas, particularly along the Balcones Escarpment and associated stream valleys, has yielded numerous Clovis find spots. The high plains contain Clovis materials, often associated with playa lake margins where mammoth and bison would have concentrated. The Trans-Pecos has produced Clovis points, but in lower densities. The Gulf Coast region has yielded relatively few Clovis finds, though this may reflect preservation bias rather than actual absence of populations. Clovis lithic technology demonstrates sophisticated stone working knowledge. Projectile points required careful selection of high-quality stone, systematic thinning through percussion and pressure flaking, and final fluting to create the characteristic channel flake scar. The fluting process was risky and resulted in breakage of many nearly finished points. The investment of time and skill indicates that these tools held significant value. Some points show evidence of repeated resharpening and maintenance, extending their use life. Clovis populations obtained stone from diverse sources. Edwards Plateau Shirt appears in Clovis assemblages across Texas and into surrounding states. The high quality and predictable flaking properties of this material made it desirable. Alabate's chert from the Texas Panhandle also circulated widely. Some Clovis points found in Texas were manufactured from stone sources hundreds of miles distant, indicating either long-distance movement of people or extensive trade networks. The presence of exotic stones at sites suggests that Clovis groups maintained broad-ranging mobility or connections. Cache sites containing multiple Clovis points and bifaces occur in Texas, though less commonly than in the Great Plains. These caches typically contain unfinished or minimally used tools buried together, possibly as ritual deposits or stored reserves. The Kincaid cache from west central Texas included numerous bifaces and points manufactured from Edwards chert. Similar caches from surrounding regions suggest this was a widespread Clovis practice. The purpose of caching remains debated, with explanations ranging from practical storage to ceremonial significance. The end of the Clovis period coincides with the extinction of North American megafauna, including mammoths, horses, camels, and several other large mammals. The causes of these extinctions remain actively debated among researchers. Climate change associated with the end of the Pleistocene altered vegetation patterns and water availability. Human hunting pressure may have contributed to population declines of species already stressed by environmental change. A comet impact has been proposed but remains controversial. The relative importance of these factors continues to be argued. Whatever the causes, megafauna extinction forced significant adaptations in human subsistence strategies. Post-Clovis populations could no longer rely on mammoth and other extinct species. They shifted focus to surviving large mammals, particularly bison and deer, and intensified use of plant resources and smaller animals. This transition marks the beginning of the Paleo-Indian to Archaic shift, though the cultural changes developed gradually over millennia rather than representing a sudden break. Post-Clovis Paleo-Indian groups developed new projectile point styles. Fulsome points, characterized by careful fluting extending nearly the full length of the point, appear in Texas beginning around 12,800 years ago. Fulsome points are most common on the high plains, where they associate with extinct bison kills. In central and southern Texas, fulsome points are rare, suggesting that populations in these regions pursued different adaptations. The regional variation in point styles begins to appear during this period, foreshadowing the increasing cultural diversity of later times. Other early point styles include Plainview, Angostura, and Golondrina. These unfluted lanceolate forms appear in various contexts across Texas between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. The relationships between these point types and their makers remain unclear. They may represent different cultural groups, chronological stages, or functional variations. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing diversity in projectile point forms compared to the relative uniformity of Clovis materials. Paleo-Indian populations after Clovis adapted to environmental and faunal changes that characterized the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene. The extinction of megafauna eliminated large, slow-moving prey species and left populations dependent on smaller, more mobile animals. Bison survived the extinctions but underwent changes in body size and behavior. The species present during the Paleo-Indian period, bison antiquus, stood larger than modern bison, but occurred in smaller herds than the massive aggregations documented in later periods. Deer, pronghorn, and various small mammals became increasingly important prey. Fulsome populations on the high plains specialized in bison hunting. Kill sites from this period show evidence of communal hunting where groups drove bison into arroyos or other natural traps. The Lubbock Lake site in the southern high plains contains a Folsom component with bison remains and associated artifacts. The site location at a spring-fed marsh provided water that attracted bison during dry periods. Hunters took advantage of this concentration to harvest multiple animals. Butchering occurred at the kill location, with choice meat portions removed and carcasses systematically processed. Folsom projectile points exhibit even more sophisticated flaking technology than Clovis. The channel flakes removed during fluting extend nearly the full length of the point, requiring exceptional skill and stone quality. Point thickness was reduced to less than 5 millimeters in many examples. This extreme thinning may have served functional purposes, improving penetration, or may have held social significance as a display of technological mastery. The high breakage rate during manufacture indicates that many attempts failed before successful completion. In central and southern Texas, Paleo-Indian adaptations followed different trajectories. Folsom points rarely appear in these regions. Instead, populations used Plainview, Golondrina, and other unfluted point types. These forms required less manufacturing investment than Folsom, but remained effective projectiles. The difference in technology may reflect differences in prey species and hunting methods. Deer hunting, which likely dominated in wooded and brushy environments, did not require the same projectile characteristics as bison hunting on open grasslands. The Wilson-Leonard site in central Texas provides detailed evidence for Paleo-Indian occupation spanning several millennia. The site, located along Brushy Creek, contained stratified deposits with multiple Paleo-Indian components. Artifacts include various point types, blade tools, scrapers, and processing equipment. Faunal remains indicate hunting of deer, small mammals, and occasional bison. The site appears to have functioned as a residential base camp where diverse activities occurred. Evidence for repeated occupation suggests that Paleo-Indian groups returned to this location multiple times over centuries. Paleo-Indian subsistence relied on hunting but also incorporated gathering of plant foods and collection of small animals. Direct evidence for plant use during this period remains limited due to poor preservation of organic materials. However, grinding stones and processing tools found at some sites indicate that plants formed part of the diet. Prickly pear, mesquite beans, grass seeds, and various nuts would have been available seasonally. The relative importance of hunted versus gathered foods likely varied by season and region. Technological diversity increased during the Paleo-Indian period. Early stages saw relatively uniform Clovis technology across broad regions. Later stages showed distinct regional traditions in projectile point manufacture, toolkits, and raw material use. This diversification suggests that populations were becoming more territorially restricted and developing local technological traditions. Exchange of exotic materials continued, but the dominance of local stone sources increased in many assemblages. Blade technology characterized some Paleo-Indian assemblages. Blades, elongated flakes struck from specially prepared cores, provided efficient cutting edges and could be produced in quantity once a core was prepared. The Galt site yielded thousands of blades from Clovis contexts. Blade production required specific core preparation techniques and striking platforms. Some researchers argue that blade technology represents a distinct tradition brought from Asia during initial colonization. Others suggest it developed independently as an efficient tool production method. Mobility patterns during the Paleo-Indian period involved regular movement across large territories. The presence of exotic lithic materials from distant sources indicates that groups traveled hundreds of miles or maintained exchange relationships over such distances. Seasonal rounds probably took groups between different elevation zones or between different resource patches as foods ripened or animals migrated. Base camps at favorable locations saw repeated occupation, while numerous small sites represent short-term hunting or processing stations. Climate during the Paleo-Indian period underwent significant changes. The Younger Dryas, a cold interval lasting from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, interrupted the general warming trend following the last glacial maximum. This cold period affected vegetation patterns and water availability. Following the Younger Dryas, warming resumed and conditions gradually approached modern configurations. Rainfall patterns shifted, with some regions becoming wetter and others drier than they had been during the late Pleistocene. These climate changes affected human populations through impacts on water availability and food resources. Springs that flowed during the late Pleistocene may have dried during warm, dry intervals. Vegetation communities shifted as temperature and rainfall changed. Animal distributions tracked these vegetation changes. Bison populations on the high plains fluctuated with grassland extent. During dry periods, bison retreated northward, and populations relying on them either followed or switched to alternative foods. The transition from Paleo-Indian to Archaic occurred gradually between approximately 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. This shift involved changes in projectile point styles, increased evidence for plant processing, and modifications in settlement patterns. The distinction between late Paleo-Indian and early Archaic remains somewhat arbitrary, as changes occurred incrementally rather than abruptly. Archaeologists define the transition differently in different regions based on local sequences. Early Archaic point styles in Texas include various corner-notched and stemmed forms. These points show greater diversity than earlier lanceolate Paleo-Indian forms. Manufacturing techniques shifted toward less intensive reduction and finishing. Points became shorter and wider on average, though considerable variation exists. The change in point morphology may relate to shifts in weaponry from thrusting or throwing spears to atlatl-thrown darts, though this remains debated. Grinding stone tools became more common in early Archaic assemblages. Manos and metates, used for grinding seeds and nuts, appear with increasing frequency. These tools indicate intensified processing of plant foods. Mesquite beans, grass seeds, acorns, and prickly pear all required grinding's extensive processing to extract nutritional value. The investment in heavy grinding stones that were difficult to transport suggests reduced mobility or repeated return to specific locations where the stones could be cached. Burned rock features appear in early archaic deposits at many sites. These features consist of fire-cracked limestone used in earth ovens for cooking plant foods. Sotol, agave, and other plants with toxic or indigestible components require prolonged cooking to become edible. Earth ovens, filled with hot rocks and covered to retain heat, could cook these foods over extended periods. The increasing frequency of burned rock features indicates that populations were intensifying use of plant resources that required labor-intensive processing. Population densities during the Paleo-Indian period remained low across all regions. The mobile hunting and gathering lifestyle required large territories to sustain each band. Environmental productivity limited the number of people the landscape could support. Estimates suggest that Paleo-Indian populations across all of Texas numbered in the low thousands at most. These small populations were distributed unevenly, with concentrations in particularly favorable areas and sparse occupation of marginal environments. The Archaic period in Texas extended from approximately 8,000 years ago to 1,300 years ago, encompassing substantial cultural and environmental changes. Archaeologists divide the Archaic into early, middle, and late subperiods based on shifts in projectile point styles, settlement patterns, and subsistence strategies. The boundaries between these divisions vary by region and remain somewhat arbitrary, but they provide a framework for understanding long-term trends. Early Archaic populations, from roughly 8,000 to 6,000 years ago, maintained high mobility similar to Paleo-Indian groups. Base camps occur along major streams and at spring locations, while smaller sites scatter across the landscape, representing short-term hunting and gathering stations. Projectile point styles diversified, with regional variants becoming more pronounced. In central Texas, early Archaic points include Angostura, Gower, Uvalde, and Martindale types. These forms show corner notching, side notching, and various stem configurations. The climate during the early Archaic trended toward warmer and drier conditions. This warming, sometimes called the altithermal, reached maximum intensity between 7,000 and 5,000 years ago. Temperatures exceeded modern levels, and rainfall decreased across much of Texas. Springs that flowed during the late Pleistocene dried or reduced their discharge. Vegetation communities shifted, with grasslands expanding at the expense of woodlands in some areas. Drought-tolerant plant species became more prevalent. These environmental changes affected human populations substantially. Water sources became critical factors determining settlement locations. Sites cluster near reliable springs and along major streams that maintained flow during dry periods. Upland areas away from permanent water show reduced evidence of occupation during the driest intervals. Populations may have concentrated in refugia where water remained available, increasing local population densities while other areas saw reduced use. Bison disappeared from most of Texas during the early and middle Archaic. The drying climate reduced grassland productivity, and bison retreated northward to more favorable ranges. Archaeological sites from this period contain deer, small mammals, reptiles, and plant remains, but rarely bison bones. The absence of bison required adaptations in hunting strategies and diet composition. Deer hunting became the primary source of large game across most regions. Small animals, including rabbits, rodents, and turtles, gained importance. Plant processing intensified during the early Archaic. Grinding stones occur with increasing frequency and size. Manos and metates show heavy use wear indicating prolonged grinding activities. The plants being processed likely included mesquite beans, grass seeds, acorns where oak trees grew, and various other seeds and nuts. Prickly pear pads and fruit provided seasonal foods. Processing these plants required substantial labor input, but yielded reliable calories when animal resources were scarce or unpredictable. Burned rock middens began accumulating during the early Archaic, but became much larger and more common in the Middle Archaic. These features consist of fire-cracked limestone and earth stained by charcoal and organic residues. They form from repeated use of earth ovens to cook plant foods, particularly sotol and agave. Each cooking episode involved digging a pit, heating rocks in a fire, placing the rocks and plant materials in the pit, covering everything with earth, and allowing it to cook for extended periods. After cooking, the cooled rocks were discarded nearby. The Middle Archaic period, extending from approximately 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, saw continued adaptation to warm, dry conditions. This interval includes the driest portion of the Holocene in Texas. Archaeological visibility decreases during parts of the Middle Archaic, possibly reflecting reduced populations or increased mobility that left fewer detectable sites. Some researchers suggest that human populations declined during the most severe drought periods or relocated to better watered regions. Sites that do exist from the Middle Archaic concentrate near permanent water sources. The Edwards Plateau, with its numerous springs, appears to have remained relatively well populated. Rock shelters in this region contain Middle Archaic deposits with diverse artifacts and food remains. The Gulf Coast also supported populations, as marine and estuarine resources provided reliable foods independent of terrestrial drought conditions. The high plains show minimal occupation during the driest intervals. Projectile point styles continued to evolve during the Middle Archaic. Central Texas types include pedernales, Langtree, and Valverde points. These forms show broad blades and expanding stems or contracting stems depending on the type. Manufacturing techniques remained relatively simple compared to earlier Paleo-Indian technology. Points were produced efficiently from local materials with minimal investment in elaborate finishing. This shift may reflect an emphasis on functional effectiveness over technological display. Trade networks during the early and Middle Archaic appear less extensive than during Paleo-Indian times. Exotic lithic materials occur less frequently in assemblages from this period. Groups relied primarily on local and regional stone sources. Edwards Plateau share remained an important material and circulated beyond the plateau, but the distances over which it traveled appear reduced compared to earlier periods. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast does appear at interior sites, indicating that some exchange continued. The late Archaic period, from approximately 4,000 to 1,300 years ago, brought significant changes in settlement patterns and social organization. Climate conditions moderated somewhat from the Middle Archaic extremes, becoming more similar to modern conditions. Rainfall increased and temperatures decreased slightly. These changes allowed vegetation communities to expand and water sources to become more reliable. Bison began returning to Texas during certain intervals, though their presence remained sporadic compared to later periods. Population densities increased markedly during the late Archaic. Archaeological sites become more numerous and larger. Burned rock middens grew to massive size, some containing thousands of cubic meters of fire-cracked stone. These middens accumulated over centuries of repeated use, indicating that groups returned regularly to the same locations. The investment in creating and maintaining these features suggests territorial behavior and reduced mobility compared to earlier periods. Cemetery sites appear during the late Archaic, providing evidence for territorial claims and social complexity. The Ernest Witt site in south-central Texas contained over 50 burials accumulated over several centuries. The Loma Sandia site in South Texas yielded over 100 burials. These cemeteries show variable burial treatment, with some individuals receiving grave goods, including projectile points, ground stone tools, and shell ornaments. Other burials contain few or no artifacts. The differential treatment suggests emerging social distinctions. Burial position and orientation varied. Some individuals were placed in extended positions, others flexed. Some burials show evidence of cremation. Red ochre accompanied certain burials, possibly used in mortuary rituals or placed on the body. Multiple burials in single pits occurred at some sites, possibly indicating simultaneous deaths from disease or violence. The overall pattern suggests diverse mortuary practices rather than uniform treatment of the dead. Evidence for violence increased during the late Archaic. Skeletal remains occasionally show projectile points embedded in bone or evidence of healed and unhealed trauma. Some cemetery populations exhibit elevated rates of cranial injuries. These patterns suggest interpersonal violence and possibly organized conflict between groups. Competition for productive territories during periods of population growth may have contributed to increased violence. However, the overall frequency of violent injuries remains modest compared to some other regions and time periods. Trade networks expanded again during the late Archaic. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast appears commonly at interior sites. Shell was manufactured into beads and pendants used for personal adornment. Certain shell species suitable for beads were preferentially selected and transported inland. Edwards Plateau chert reached the coast and the high plains. Alabates chert from the northern plains appears in late Archaic contexts in central Texas. These patterns indicate renewed long-distance exchange of both utilitarian and prestige materials. The late Archaic also saw technological innovations. The atlatl, a spear-throwing device that increased projectile velocity and range, may have been introduced during this period, though direct evidence is limited. Weights made of polished stone, interpreted as atlatl weights, appear in late Archaic assemblages. These weights attached to the atlatl shaft to increase leverage and power. Their presence suggests refinements in hunting technology that improved efficiency. Plant processing technology became more diverse. In addition to grinding stones and earth ovens, populations used heated rocks to boil water in containers. Cooking baskets or hide containers filled with water could be heated by dropping hot stones into them. This method allowed cooking of foods that could not be ground or baked. Seeds, greens, and possibly animal parts were cooked this way. The technique required substantial fuel to heat rocks repeatedly, but provided flexibility in food preparation. The Gulf Coast of Texas provided fundamentally different subsistence opportunities than interior regions. Estuaries, bays, and barrier islands supported abundant fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and marine mammals. These resources were available year-round, reducing the seasonal mobility required in other environments. Archaeological evidence indicates intensive coastal occupation during the late Archaic and late prehistoric periods, though earlier materials have been obscured by rising sea levels and coastal erosion. Sea level rise following the end of the Pleistocene transformed the coastal landscape. At the glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, sea levels stood approximately 120 meters lower than present. The coastline extended many miles beyond its current position, and the continental shelf formed a broad coastal plain. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose episodically. Major transgressive events occurred around 14,000, 11,000, and 7,000 years ago. By approximately 4,000 years ago, sea level approached its current position. This rising sea level drowned the early coastal plain and early archaeological sites. Any Paleo-Indian or early archaic coastal settlements now lie beneath the Gulf of Mexico. The oldest accessible coastal sites date to the Middle and Late Archaic periods, after sea level stabilized near modern levels. The archaeological record of coastal occupation therefore begins relatively late, despite probable earlier use of coastal resources. Shell middens dominate coastal archaeology. These accumulations of discarded oyster, clam, and other mollusk shells mark locations where shellfish were harvested and processed. Some middens extend several meters thick and cover areas of several hectares. Radiocarbon dates from shells and charcoal indicate that many middens accumulated over centuries or millennia of repeated occupation. The size and duration of these accumulations suggests that coastal groups returned regularly to productive harvesting locations. Oysters formed the primary shellfish resource at most sites. Oyster reefs in estuaries provided nearly limitless quantities of protein accessible with minimal technology. Collection required only knowledge of reef locations and timing of tides. Oysters could be harvested year-round, though productivity varied seasonally with oyster spawning and water temperature. Other shellfish, including Rangia clams, arc shells, and conch, also appear in middens, but generally in lower quantities than oysters. Fish remains occur abundantly in coastal sites. Species identified include redfish, sea catfish, drum, sheepshead, and numerous others inhabiting estuarine and nearshore waters. Fishing technology likely included nets, traps, hooks, and spears. Some fish could be taken from shore, while others required boats to reach productive fishing areas. Bones of sharks and rays indicate that larger marine species were also caught. The diversity of fish species in archaeological assemblages demonstrates detailed knowledge of fish behavior and habitat. Evidence for watercraft remains limited, but circumstantial evidence suggests boats were used. Islands in bays and sounds contain archaeological sites indicating human occupation. These islands could not be reached without boats during most of the Holocene. The presence of large fish species and marine mammals in coastal assemblages also suggests offshore fishing or hunting that would require watercraft. The boats themselves were likely dugout canoes or rafts that did not preserve in the archaeological record. Waterfowl provided seasonal resources on the coast. Ducks, geese, and other migratory birds concentrated in coastal wetlands during winter months. Resident species, including herons, pelicans, and gulls, were available year-round. Bird bones appear in coastal sites, though in lower quantities than fish and shellfish. Feathers and down could have been used for decoration or insulation. Eggs from colonial nesting birds provided seasonal food sources. Terrestrial mammals were hunted from coastal sites. Deer were the primary large game animal, though less abundant on the coast than in interior regions. White-tailed deer ranged into coastal prairies and oak mottes. Smaller mammals, including raccoons, opossums, and rabbits, appear in faunal assemblages. Bison occasionally range to the coast during certain periods, and bison bones appear in some coastal sites dating to intervals when bison were present in South Texas. Plant resources on the coast differed from interior regions. Oak trees grew in mottes on slightly elevated ground, providing acorns seasonally. Prickly pear thrived in coastal prairies. Sea purslane and other salt-tolerant plants provided greens. Berries from various shrubs ripened seasonally. However, the overall diversity and productivity of plant resources was lower on the coast than in interior regions. Coastal populations relied more heavily on aquatic resources than did interior groups. Stone for tool manufacture was scarce on the coast. Beach cobbles provided some material, but coastal gravels generally lack high-quality chert or other tool stones. Coastal populations imported stone from interior sources or relied on shell for cutting tools. Shell scrapers, knives, and other implements appear commonly in coastal assemblages. Some tools were manufactured from conch shell, which could be worked into durable cutting edges. The scarcity of good stone meant that imported lithic tools were carefully curated and used until exhausted. Settlement patterns on the coast involved both permanent and seasonal camps. Large shell middens with deep deposits and diverse artifacts appear to represent base camps occupied repeatedly or continuously. Smaller sites with lighter artifact densities and thinner deposits may represent seasonal or special-purpose camps. The distinction between residential bases and extractive camps shows similar patterning to interior sites, but coastal resources allowed longer occupation at individual locations. Population densities on the coast during the late Archaic and late prehistoric periods appear to have been relatively high. The abundance and reliability of shellfish and fish supported more people per unit area than could be sustained in most interior environments. However, precise population estimates remain difficult. The number of contemporaneous sites versus sequentially occupied locations cannot always be determined. Some large middens may represent the accumulations of small groups over long periods rather than large populations. Interior riverine environments provided resources intermediate between coastal estuaries and upland areas. Major river valleys in Texas contained reliable water, diverse aquatic resources, and riparian vegetation that attracted game animals. Archaeological sites cluster along rivers and major tributaries throughout the Archaic period. These locations served as focal points for settlement, with groups moving between river camps and upland foraging areas. The Colorado River drainage in central Texas shows intensive occupation during the Archaic period. Sites occur at intervals along the main channel and major tributaries. Rock shelters in canyon walls provided shelter and preserved organic remains. Open sites on terraces above the floodplain contain living surfaces, hearths, and artifact concentrations. The distribution of sites suggests that groups moved up and down the drainage seasonally, using different microenvironments as resources became available. Freshwater mussels from rivers and streams provided protein similar to coastal shellfish. Mussel shells accumulate at riverine sites, forming freshwater shell middens. These deposits are generally smaller than coastal shell middens, but indicate regular exploitation of this resource. Mussels were collected from gravel bars and slow-moving pools where they concentrated. Processing involved steaming or boiling to open the shells. The meat was consumed fresh or possibly dried for storage. Fish in interior rivers included catfish, gar, suckers, bass, and sunfish. These species occupied different habitats within river systems and were available in different seasons. Catfish could be caught in deep pools, particularly during low water. Gar frequented shallow, weedy areas. Bass and sunfish inhabited a variety of habitats. Fishing technology probably included hooks, nets, traps, and spears, similar to coastal populations, but adapted to riverine conditions. Riparian vegetation along rivers provided concentrated plant resources. Pecan, walnut, and oak trees grew in bottomlands and on terraces, producing nuts seasonally. Hackberry, persimmon, and wild grape provided additional fruits. These resources ripened in late summer and fall, creating a predictable harvest period that attracted human groups. Storage of nuts allowed consumption into winter months when other foods were less abundant. The reliability and productivity of riverine nut resources made river valleys particularly attractive settlement locations. The late Archaic period in Texas saw the development of distinctive regional traditions and increasing evidence of social differentiation. From approximately 4,000 to 1,300 years ago, populations grew, territories became more clearly defined, and material culture showed regional variation that reflected both environmental adaptation and cultural identity. The late Archaic represents the culmination of trends toward reduced mobility and intensified resource use that began earlier in the Archaic sequence. Burned rock midden sites reached their maximum size and complexity during the late Archaic. These features, composed primarily of fire-cracked limestone from earth oven cooking, accumulated to enormous proportions at some locations. Individual middens measuring 30 to 50 meters in diameter and 2 to 4 meters deep contain hundreds of tons of fractured stone. The investment required to create these features indicates prolonged and repeated use of specific locations over many generations. The distribution of burned rock middens concentrates in the Edwards Plateau and surrounding areas where limestone bedrock provided abundant heating stones, and sotol, lechugila, and agave plants grew naturally. Groups dug pits into the ground, lined them with limestone rocks heated in adjacent fires, placed plant materials on the hot rocks, covered everything with earth and vegetation, and allowed the contents to cook for 1 to 3 days. After cooking, the plants were removed, consumed, or processed further, and the cooled rocks were discarded nearby. Analysis of residues from burned rocks indicates that sotol and related plants were the primary foods cooked. These plants contain toxic or indigestible compounds that require prolonged heating to neutralize. The underground stems or hearts of these plants become sweet and edible after extensive cooking. A single earth oven could process hundreds of pounds of plant material, producing substantial calories. However, harvesting and processing these plants required significant labor input, including digging plants, transporting them to processing sites, gathering fuel and rocks, and tending fires. The repeated use of specific midden locations suggests territorial organization. Groups needed assured access to plant harvesting areas, fuel sources, and midden sites to justify the investment in creating and maintaining earth ovens. This pattern indicates that late Archaic populations maintained defined territories and defended or negotiated access to productive resource patches. The development of territorial behavior represents a significant shift from the more fluid mobility of earlier periods. Cemetery sites from the late Archaic provide additional evidence for territoriality and social organization. Burial grounds appear to mark territorial claims, signaling to other groups that the surrounding area belonged to those who maintained the cemetery. The Loma Sandia site in southern Texas contained over 100 burials spanning several centuries. The Ernest Witt site in south-central Texas yielded more than 50 burials. Other cemeteries contain smaller numbers, but show similar patterns of accumulated interments over time. Grave goods show variable distribution among burials. Some individuals received numerous artifacts, including projectile points, groundstone tools, shell beads, bone tools, and ochre. Others were buried with few items or none at all. This differential treatment suggests social distinctions, though the nature of those distinctions remains debated. Age and sex differences may account for some variation. Achieved status based on hunting prowess, ritual knowledge, or other accomplishments may explain other patterns. Inherited status remains difficult to demonstrate, but cannot be ruled out. Riparian vegetation along rivers provided concentrated plant resources. Pecan, walnut, and oak trees grew in bottomlands and on terraces, producing nuts seasonally. Hackberry, persimmon, and wild grape provided additional fruits. These resources ripened in late summer and fall, creating a predictable harvest period that attracted human groups. Storage of nuts allowed consumption into winter months when other foods were less abundant. The reliability and productivity of riverine nut resources made river valleys particularly attractive settlement locations. The late Archaic period in Texas saw the development of distinctive regional traditions and increasing evidence of social differentiation. From approximately 4,000 to 1,300 years ago, populations grew, territories became more clearly defined, and material culture showed regional variation that reflected both environmental adaptation and cultural identity. The late Archaic represents the culmination of trends toward reduced mobility and intensified resource use that began earlier in the Archaic sequence. Burned rock midden sites reached their maximum size and complexity during the late Archaic. These features, composed primarily of fire-cracked limestone from earth oven cooking, accumulated to enormous proportions at some locations. Individual middens measuring 30 to 50 meters in diameter and 2 to 4 meters deep contain hundreds of tons of fractured stone. The investment required to create these features indicates prolonged and repeated use of specific locations over many generations. The distribution of burned rock middens concentrates in the Edwards Plateau and surrounding areas where limestone bedrock provided abundant heating stones, and sotol, lechugila, and agave plants grew naturally. Groups dug pits into the ground, lined them with limestone rocks heated in adjacent fires, placed plant materials on the hot rocks, covered everything with earth and vegetation, and allowed the contents to cook for 1 to 3 days. After cooking, the plants were removed, consumed or processed further, and the cooled rocks were discarded nearby. Analysis of residues from burned rocks indicates that sotol and related plants were the primary foods cooked. These plants contain toxic or indigestible compounds that require prolonged heating to neutralize. The underground stems or hearts of these plants become sweet and edible after extensive cooking. A single earth oven could process hundreds of pounds of plant material, producing substantial calories. However, harvesting and processing these plants required significant labor input, including digging plants, transporting them to processing sites, gathering fuel and rocks, and tending fires. The repeated use of specific midden locations suggests territorial organization. Groups needed assured access to plant harvesting areas, fuel sources, and midden sites to justify the investment in creating and maintaining earth ovens. This pattern indicates that late Archaic populations maintained defined territories and defended or negotiated access to productive resource patches. The development of territorial behavior represents a significant shift from the more fluid mobility of earlier periods. Cemetery sites from the late Archaic provide additional evidence for territoriality and social organization. Burial grounds appear to mark territorial claims, signaling to other groups that the surrounding area belonged to those who maintained the cemetery. The Loma Sandia site in southern Texas contained over 100 burials spanning several centuries. The Ernest Witt site in south-central Texas yielded more than 50 burials. Other cemeteries contain smaller numbers, but show similar patterns of accumulated interments over time. Grave goods show variable distribution among burials. Some individuals received numerous artifacts, including projectile points, groundstone tools, shell beads, bone tools, and ochre. Others were buried with few items or none at all. This differential treatment suggests social distinctions, though the nature of those distinctions remains debated. Age and sex differences may account for some variation. Achieved status based on hunting prowess, ritual knowledge, or other accomplishments may explain other patterns. Inherited status remains difficult to demonstrate, but cannot be ruled out. Skeletal analysis from late Archaic cemeteries reveals information about health, diet, and activity patterns. Dental wear indicates heavy reliance on processed plant foods containing grit from grinding stones. Tooth wear progressed throughout life, eventually exposing pulp cavities in older individuals. Caries rates were low, suggesting limited consumption of refined carbohydrates. Bone chemistry analysis indicates diets composed of mixed terrestrial plant and animal sources with regional variation in the relative proportions. Evidence for violence appears in some cemetery populations. Projectile points embedded in vertebrae, ribs, and other bones document lethal injuries. Healed fractures of forearm bones suggest defensive injuries sustained while warding off blows. Cranial depression fractures indicate blunt force trauma. The frequency of such injuries varies among cemeteries, with some populations showing elevated rates compared to others. The overall pattern suggests that interpersonal violence occurred regularly but did not dominate social interactions. The introduction of the bow and arrow during the late Archaic transformed hunting technology. The bow provided advantages over the atlatl in terms of accuracy, rate of fire, and ease of use in dense vegetation. Arrow points differ morphologically from earlier dart points, being smaller and lighter. The transition from atlatl to bow occurred gradually, with both technologies coexisting during a transitional period. By approximately 1,300 years ago, the bow had largely replaced the atlatl across Texas. Arrow point styles show considerable regional variation. In central Texas, Scalorn and Edwards points characterize the earliest arrow point assemblages. These small, thin points show careful manufacture and symmetrical form. In East Texas, different styles prevailed, including Friley and Hayes types. On the high plains, Washita and Harrell points appear. The regional diversity in arrow point styles reflects both functional adaptations to different prey species and cultural preferences among distinct populations. Trade networks during the late Archaic expanded to unprecedented geographic scales. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast appears at sites hundreds of miles inland. Conch shell columella beads were manufactured on the coast and traded into the interior, where they appear in burial contexts and habitation sites. Other shell species, including olive shells and marginella shells, also circulated inland. The labor investment in manufacturing shell beads and the distances they traveled suggest these items held significant social value. Edwards Plateau shirt moved in all directions from central Texas. This high-quality stone appears in assemblages on the coast, in East Texas, on the high plains, and in the Trans-Pecos. The distinctive visual properties of certain Edwards chert variants allow source identification. Heat-treated chert, which improves flaking properties through controlled heating, appears increasingly during the late Archaic. The investment in heat treatment indicates concern with tool quality and performance. Alabate's chert from the Canadian River breaks in the northern Texas Panhandle circulated widely across the southern plains and into central Texas. This banded or mottled chert occurs in distinctive colors and patterns that make it readily identifiable. Artifacts manufactured from Alabate's chert appear in sites hundreds of miles from the source. The presence of this material demonstrates connections between populations across the plains and into surrounding regions. Obsidian appears rarely in Texas archaeological sites, but occurs with increasing frequency during the late Archaic. Obsidian sources exist in the Trans-Pecos region and in New Mexico. Chemical characterization of obsidian artifacts allows determination of specific source areas. Most obsidian in Texas sites derives from sources in New Mexico and West Texas. The distances involved indicate either long-distance travel to sources or down-the-line exchange through multiple intermediary groups. Groundstone tools became more diverse and specialized during the late Archaic. Monos and metates for grinding seeds and nuts show varying forms adapted to different plant resources. Basin metats with deep grinding surfaces suited processing of oily seeds. Flat or slightly concave metats worked better for harder materials. Mortars and pestles appear for pounding rather than grinding. Stone bowls, laboriously manufactured by pecking and grinding, appear in some late archaic contexts. Bone tools expanded in variety and frequency. Awls for perforating hides and working fibers occur commonly. Needles with eyes for thread appear in some assemblages. Fishhooks manufactured from bone and shell document fishing technology. Ornaments, including bone beads and pendants, served decorative purposes. The increased investment in bone tool manufacture indicates that perishable technologies, which rarely preserve, were becoming more elaborate. Regional differentiation became increasingly pronounced during the late Archaic. Central Texas populations maintained high mobility focused on seasonal rounds between upland plant resources and riverine base camps. East Texas populations began developing more sedentary settlement patterns with larger, longer occupied villages. The High Plains saw episodic occupation tied to bison presence. The Gulf Coast supported dense populations focused on estuarine resources. These regional patterns foreshadowed the even greater differentiation that characterized the subsequent late prehistoric period. Regional variation in prehistoric adaptations across Texas became most pronounced during the late prehistoric period and the final centuries of the late Archaic. Environmental diversity created fundamentally different subsistence opportunities and constraints that shaped distinct cultural trajectories. The differences between coastal, interior plateau, eastern forest, high plains, and desert regions produced populations with varying settlement patterns, technologies, and social organizations. Central Texas populations occupying the Edwards Plateau and surrounding areas maintained subsistence strategies focused on hunting and gathering. Bison returned to this region during certain intervals, supplementing deer as the primary large game animal. Archaeological sites from the late prehistoric period contain both bison and deer remains, with the relative proportions varying by time and location. When bison were present, hunting strategies shifted to accommodate these larger herd-living animals. When bison were absent, populations reverted to deer hunting and intensified plant gathering. The appearance of bison in central Texas correlates with climate fluctuations. During cooler, wetter intervals, grasslands expanded and bison ranges extended southward. During warmer, drier periods, woodlands expanded at grassland expense and bison retreated northward. These climate oscillations occurred on timescales of centuries, with several expansions and contractions documented in the archaeological and paleo-environmental record. Human populations adapted to this variability by maintaining flexible subsistence strategies. Rock shelters in the Edwards Plateau canyons continued to serve as important habitation sites. These shelters provided protection from weather and predators, level floors for living and working, and preservation conditions that retained organic materials. Excavations and shelters have recovered perishable artifacts rarely found at open sites, including cordage, basketry fragments, wooden tools, and plant remains. The preservation of these materials provides insights into technologies and activities that are otherwise archaeologically invisible. Hines Cave and other rock shelters in the lower Pecos region contain exceptionally well-preserved deposits spanning thousands of years. Dry conditions in these shelters allowed preservation of normally perishable materials. Analysis of coprolites, preserved human feces, reveals detailed information about diet composition. These analyses show consumption of diverse plant species, including prickly pear, sotol, lechuguilla, mesquite beans, various seeds, and occasional animal remains. The specificity of botanical identifications from coprolites surpasses what can be determined from charred plant remains. Pictographs and petroglyphs in Lower Pecos rock shelters represent some of the most extensive rock art traditions in North America. Paintings cover shelter walls with polychrome images depicting humans, animals, geometric designs, and abstract motifs. Multiple styles and periods of art production are evident. Some images overlay others, indicating prolonged artistic activity. The meanings and functions of this art remain debated, with interpretations ranging from shamanic ritual to territorial markers to narrative scenes. East Texas cultural developments diverged significantly from Central Texas patterns. Populations in the piney woods and adjacent areas began adopting agriculture, constructing earthen mounds, and developing more complex social organization during the late prehistoric period. These changes aligned with broader trends across the southeastern United States. The Caddo archaeological tradition emerged in northeast Texas around 1,300 years ago and persisted until European contact. Caddo populations cultivated maize, beans, squash, and sunflowers in addition to gathering wild plant resources and hunting. Agriculture provided a reliable food base that supported larger, more sedentary communities. Villages consisted of dispersed farmsteads and hamlets organized around ceremonial centers. Houses were substantial structures built of wooden poles covered with grass thatch. These dwellings could accommodate extended families and provided secure storage for agricultural products. Earthen mounds characterize Caddo ceremonial centers. These structures were built by accumulating basket loads of earth to create raised platforms. Mounds supported temples or elite residences, elevating these structures above the surrounding landscape. Some mounds served as burial locations for high-status individuals. The labor investment required to construct these mounds indicates social organization capable of mobilizing substantial workforces for communal projects. Caddo pottery represents a highly developed ceramic tradition. Vessels were manufactured using coiling techniques and finished with careful smoothing or burnishing. Surface treatments included incising, engraving, punctation, and application of slips. Vessel forms included jars for storage and cooking, bowls for serving, bottles for liquids, and specialized forms for ritual purposes. Decorative motifs showed regional and temporal variation, allowing archaeologists to distinguish different Caddo phases and communities. Social organization among Caddo populations involved hereditary leadership and ranked social positions. Elite individuals received elaborate burial treatment, including placement in mounds, numerous grave goods, and special mortuary facilities. Grave goods included finely made pottery, marine shell ornaments, copper artifacts, stone tools, and exotic materials from distant sources. The concentration of wealth and elaborate treatment with certain individuals indicates institutionalized social hierarchy. Trade networks connected Caddo populations with groups across the southeastern United States and into the Great Plains. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast and Atlantic Coast appears in Caddo sites. Copper from the Great Lakes region occurs in burial contexts. Obsidian from western sources reached East Texas in small quantities. Caddo pottery and other manufactures circulated outward to surrounding regions. These exchange networks moved both utilitarian items and prestige goods used in status display and ritual activities. Bois d'Arc culture in north-central Texas represents a transitional zone between Caddo and Plains populations. Sites show influences from both areas, with limited agriculture, modest mound construction, and plain-style projectile points. Population densities remained lower than in the Caddo heartland. Settlement patterns involved seasonal movement between agricultural villages and hunting camps. The cultural position of these groups reflects their geographic location between different environmental and cultural zones. The high plains during the late prehistoric period saw intensified bison hunting when climate conditions favored bison presence. The introduction of the bow and arrow improved hunting efficiency. Communal bison hunting involved groups working cooperatively to drive herds into arroyos, over cliffs, or into constructed pounds where animals could be dispatched. Kill sites contain remains of numerous bison butchered on location, with choice portions removed and the rest abandoned. The buried city complex in the northern Texas Panhandle represents late prehistoric occupation contemporary with Plains village traditions to the north. Sites contain semi-subterranean houses, storage pits, and evidence for intensive bison processing. Populations cultivated limited amounts of corn and squash, but remained primarily dependent on bison and wild plant foods. The settlement pattern involved seasonal aggregation at favorable locations and dispersal during other periods. Alabate's flint quarries in the Texas Panhandle provided high-quality stone used for tool manufacture and trade. These quarries show evidence of intensive use during the late prehistoric period. Procurement involved removing overburden to access chert-bearing layers, extracting nodules, and conducting initial reduction on site. Debris from quarrying and tool manufacture accumulates densely around productive outcrops. The volume of material removed indicates that these quarries supplied stone to populations across a wide area. The Trans-Pecos region remained sparsely populated throughout the late prehistoric period. Water scarcity limited population densities. Groups occupied rock shelters in mountain canyons and camped near springs in desert basins. Subsistence relied on hunting desert-adapted animals, including deer, rabbits, and various rodents, and gathering desert plants, including agave, sotol, prickly pear, mesquite, and yucca. Processing technologies emphasized earth oven cooking of succulent plants. Jornada Mogolon influence appeared in the western Trans-Pecos during the late prehistoric period. This cultural tradition, centered in southern New Mexico, extended into far west Texas. Characteristics include pit house architecture, brown ware pottery, and cultivation of maize in areas where water allowed. However, most of the Trans-Pecos remained too arid for agriculture. Populations in this region maintained hunting and gathering subsistence similar to earlier periods, while selectively adopting certain technological innovations from southwestern neighbors. The late prehistoric period across Texas involved technological innovations, population changes, and intensified exploitation of key resources. Beginning around 1300 years ago and extending to European contact, this period saw the widespread adoption of the bow and arrow, the introduction of ceramics in some regions, and shifts in settlement patterns that varied by environmental zone. These changes occurred within existing cultural frameworks rather than representing complete breaks with earlier traditions. The bow and arrow replaced the atlatl and dart across most of Texas by approximately 1,000 years ago. Arrow points differ from earlier dart points in size and manufacturing technique. Most arrow points measure less than 4 centimeters in length and weigh only a few grams. The reduction in size reflects the lower mass requirements for arrows compared to darts. Manufacturing techniques emphasized efficient production over elaborate finishing, though some arrow points show careful workmanship. Multiple arrow point styles appeared during the late prehistoric period. In central Texas, Scalorn and Edwards points characterized early arrow technology. These small triangular forms with side or corner notches allowed secure hafting to arrow shafts. Later styles, including Purdy's and Clifton points, showed different notching patterns and blade configurations. The succession of styles provides chronological markers for late prehistoric assemblages. Regional variation in point styles indicates distinct cultural preferences or functional adaptations. Pottery appeared in East Texas with the emergence of Caddo culture, but remained absent or rare in central and western Texas throughout the late prehistoric period. The absence of pottery in these regions does not indicate technological ignorance, as populations certainly encountered ceramics through trade and interaction with pottery-using groups. Instead, mobile hunting and gathering lifestyles made pottery less practical than more portable containers. Baskets, hide bags, and wooden vessels served container functions without the weight and fragility of ceramics. Where pottery did appear in central Texas, vessels were simple and utilitarian. Bone-tempered plain wares occur in small quantities at some sites. These vessels show basic forming techniques and minimal surface treatment. The scarcity suggests occasional manufacture or acquisition rather than regular production. Functions probably included cooking and storage at semi-permanent camps. The limited adoption of pottery contrasts sharply with the elaborate ceramic traditions of East Texas. Bison hunting intensified during periods when bison were present in Central and North Texas. Climate reconstructions indicate several intervals of increased effective moisture that expanded grasslands and drew bison southward. These expansions occurred around 1,000 years ago, 600 years ago, and during the final centuries before European contact. Archaeological sites from these periods contain elevated frequencies of bison remains and associated processing tools. Communal bison hunting required coordination among multiple groups. Drives involved positioning hunters to direct bison movement toward kill locations. These operations succeeded best with substantial numbers of participants. The aggregation of multiple bands for communal hunts created opportunities for social interaction, information exchange, mate selection, and trade. Kill sites show evidence of intensive processing, with every usable part of carcasses utilized or removed. Hide processing became increasingly important as bison hunting intensified. Bison hides provided material for clothing, shelter covers, containers, and other items. Processing hides required scraping tools to remove flesh and fat, followed by treatment with brain tans or other substances to preserve and soften the leather. Stone scrapers and bone-fleshing tools occur commonly at bison kill and processing sites. The labor investment in hide preparation was substantial, but yielded valuable products. Storage of food resources became more important during the late prehistoric period. Storage pits occur at some sites, particularly in areas where groups occupied locations for extended periods. These pits were excavated into sediments, used for storing dried meat, processed plant foods, or seeds, then eventually abandoned and filled with refuse. Storage allowed populations to accumulate surplus during productive seasons and draw on reserves during lean periods. This strategy reduced risk and permitted longer occupation of favorable locations. Population growth appears to have occurred during the late prehistoric period in most regions. Site densities increase, suggesting more people on the landscape. Cemetery populations grow larger. Settlement patterns shift toward more intensive use of productive areas. However, population estimates remain highly uncertain. The relationship between site numbers and actual population counts depends on mobility rates, site reoccupation frequency, and preservation factors that are difficult to determine precisely. Competition for resources may have increased with population growth. Evidence for violent conflict appears more frequently in late prehistoric contexts compared to earlier periods. Defended site locations on hilltops or in rock shelters with limited access suggest concern about attack. Skeletal remains show violent trauma in some populations. However, the overall frequency of violence remains moderate. Most populations appear to have managed resource competition through territorial agreements and periodic aggregations rather than sustained warfare. Trade networks during the late prehistoric period connected populations across vast distances. The circulation of Alabates chert from the northern high plains reached central and southern Texas. Edwards Plateau chert moved in multiple directions from central Texas. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast appears at sites throughout the interior. Obsidian from New Mexico and Trans-Pecos sources occurs in small quantities across a wide area. The movement of these materials indicates maintained exchange relationships among populations separated by hundreds of miles. Turquoise and other southwestern materials appear in late prehistoric contexts in Texas, indicating connections with populations in New Mexico and Arizona. Turquoise beads and pendants occur occasionally in burial contexts and occupation sites. The rarity of these items and their contexts suggest high social value. Other southwestern materials, including Pueblo pottery sherds, appear very rarely, indicating limited but real interaction between Texas and southwestern populations. Smoking pipes manufactured from stone or ceramic appear in late prehistoric assemblages. These objects indicate tobacco use or other plant smoking. Pipe forms vary from simple tubes to more elaborate elbow forms with decorated bowls. The presence of pipes in burial contexts suggests ritual or ceremonial significance beyond utilitarian smoking. Tobacco and other psychoactive plants may have been used in religious or healing practices. Increased evidence for specialized activities appears in late prehistoric sites. Certain locations show concentrations of tool manufacturing debris, suggesting specialized workshops. Other sites contain abundant processing tools but limited manufacturing debris, indicating different functional emphasis. Shell bead manufacturing sites on the coast show concentrated evidence for ornament production. This functional differentiation suggests increasing specialization and possibly exchange of manufactured goods. Agricultural experimentation occurred in some areas of central Texas during the final centuries before contact. Small quantities of maize appear at a few sites, indicating limited cultivation. However, agriculture never became economically important in this region. The unpredictable rainfall, periodic droughts, and abundance of wild resources made farming a risky proposition with limited benefits. Populations maintained their hunting and gathering subsistence despite awareness of agricultural possibilities. Hide processing became increasingly important as bison hunting intensified. Bison hides provided material for clothing, shelter covers, containers, and other items. Processing hides required scraping tools to remove flesh and fat, followed by treatment with brain tans or other substances to preserve and soften the leather. Stone scrapers and bone-fleshing tools occur commonly at bison kill and processing sites. The labor investment in hide preparation was substantial, but yielded valuable products. Storage of food resources became more important during the late prehistoric period. Storage pits occur at some sites, particularly in areas where groups occupied locations for extended periods. These pits were excavated into sediments, used for storing dried meat, processed plant foods, or seeds, then eventually abandoned and filled with refuse. Storage allowed populations to accumulate surplus during productive seasons and draw on reserves during lean periods. This strategy reduced risk and permitted longer occupation of favorable locations. Population growth appears to have occurred during the late prehistoric period in most regions. Site densities increase, suggesting more people on the landscape. Cemetery populations grow larger. Settlement patterns shift toward more intensive use of productive areas. However, population estimates remain highly uncertain. The relationship between site numbers and actual population counts depends on mobility rates, site reoccupation frequency, and preservation factors that are difficult to determine precisely. Competition for resources may have increased with population growth. Evidence for violent conflict appears more frequently in late prehistoric contexts compared to earlier periods. Defended site locations on hilltops or in rock shelters with limited access suggest concern about attack. Skeletal remains show violent trauma in some populations. However, the overall frequency of violence remains moderate. Most populations appear to have managed resource competition through territorial agreements and periodic aggregations rather than sustained warfare. Trade networks during the late prehistoric period connected populations across vast distances. The circulation of Alabates chert from the northern high plains reached central and southern Texas. Edwards Plateau chert moved in multiple directions from central Texas. Marine shell from the Gulf Coast appears at sites throughout the interior. Obsidian from New Mexico and Trans-Pecos sources occurs in small quantities across a wide area. The movement of these materials indicates maintained exchange relationships among populations separated by hundreds of miles. Turquoise and other southwestern materials appear in late prehistoric contexts in Texas, indicating connections with populations in New Mexico and Arizona. Turquoise beads and pendants occur occasionally in burial contexts and occupation sites. The rarity of these items and their contexts suggest high social value. Other southwestern materials, including Pueblo pottery sherds, appear very rarely, indicating limited but real interaction between Texas and southwestern populations. Smoking pipes manufactured from stone or ceramic appear in late prehistoric assemblages. These objects indicate tobacco use or other plant smoking. Pipe forms vary from simple tubes to more elaborate elbow forms with decorated bowls. The presence of pipes in burial contexts suggests ritual or ceremonial significance beyond utilitarian smoking. Tobacco and other psychoactive plants may have been used in religious or healing practices. Increased evidence for specialized activities appears in late prehistoric sites. Certain locations show concentrations of tool manufacturing debris, suggesting specialized workshops. Other sites contain abundant processing tools but limited manufacturing debris, indicating different functional emphasis. Shell bead manufacturing sites on the coast show concentrated evidence for ornament production. This functional differentiation suggests increasing specialization and possibly exchange of manufactured goods. Agricultural experimentation occurred in some areas of central Texas during the final centuries before contact. Small quantities of maize appear at a few sites, indicating limited cultivation. However, agriculture never became economically important in this region. The unpredictable rainfall, periodic droughts, and abundance of wild resources made farming a risky proposition with limited benefits. Populations maintained their hunting and gathering subsistence despite awareness of agricultural possibilities. Apache groups moved into Texas from the north during the 17th century, displacing or absorbing some indigenous populations. These migrations reflected broader population movements and conflicts across the southern plains. Comanche expansion into Texas during the 18th century created additional pressures on remaining indigenous groups. The combined effects of European diseases, colonial expansion, and pressure from immigrant groups transformed the demographic and cultural landscape. Coastal populations suffered particularly severe declines. Spanish accounts from the late 17th and early 18th centuries describe much smaller populations than earlier estimates would suggest. Many coastal groups disappeared entirely or merged with surviving populations. The archaeological record of shell middens and coastal sites ends during this period, as populations were either eliminated or relocated inland. The specialized coastal adaptations that had persisted for millennia ceased to function. Central Texas populations maintained independence longer than coastal or East Texas groups. The Edwards Plateau and surrounding areas offered refuge from Spanish control. However, disease, pressure from Apache and Comanche groups, and eventually Anglo-American settlement during the 19th century eliminated or displaced these populations as well. The archaeological record of burned rock middens and rock shelter occupation ends during the 18th and 19th centuries. East Texas Caddo populations declined from tens of thousands at contact to a few thousand by the late 18th century. Disease epidemics, warfare with immigrant groups, and Spanish colonial disruption combined to reduce populations drastically. Survivors consolidated into fewer, larger communities and eventually migrated to Oklahoma during the 19th century. The elaborate mound centers and dispersed village patterns documented archaeologically ceased to exist. The disruption of indigenous populations proceeded unevenly across Texas. Some areas saw rapid collapse following initial contact. Others maintained indigenous presence into the 18th or 19th centuries. However, by the mid-19th century, few indigenous populations remained in Texas. Those who survived had been displaced to reservations outside the state or lived in small remnant communities bearing little resemblance to their prehistoric ancestors. The end of prehistoric lifeways in Texas resulted from multiple factors operating over several centuries. Disease proved the most devastating immediate cause of population decline. European and later Anglo-American colonial expansion disrupted settlement patterns and access to resources. Competition with immigrant indigenous groups from other regions added additional pressures. The combined effects eliminated populations, displaced survivors, and ended cultural traditions that had developed over more than 13,000 years. Archaeological evidence for the contact period remains limited compared to earlier periods. Few sites contain clear evidence of the transition between prehistoric and historic times. Those that do exist show mixtures of indigenous and European materials, indicating the adoption of some European technologies while indigenous cultural patterns persisted. Metal tools, glass beads, and other European items appear in indigenous contexts. However, the rapid population collapse meant that this transitional period lasted only decades in most areas. The study of prehistoric Texas provides documentation of human adaptations to diverse environments over millennia. These populations developed successful subsistence strategies, maintained extensive trade networks, and created distinct regional cultures. The archaeological record preserves evidence of technological innovations, social developments, and responses to environmental changes. The destruction of these populations and their cultures represents one consequence of European expansion into the Americas. The material remains they left constitute the primary record of their existence and achievements.